solving the question which we got to work out.
That's one thing. Stephen, we usually wait like a few minutes. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I recognise I
Yes.
teach at the MRC.
Okay, so everything's recorded.
Use my language.
No, it's fine, yeah, so this will, if you do want to forward it, you just push it down. No, but again, by substitute. I know that, so Missy Davis, yeah, so his previous shown on Missy Davis, I consider the page where it didn't give you but they were advised by as well as their done so on. Okay, everyone, we'll make a start. Thanks all for coming. Thanks especially to Stephen for coming all the way from Cambridge today and trying to get through the traffic. So I'll quickly introduce you to Stephen. So yes, as I say, Stephen's come all the way from Cambridge, where he's a reader in Computational Neuroscience. But today we're going to be talking about something completely different, in a way, which is being bullied into bad science, which was set up by a few ECRs and Stephen at Cambridge, which hopefully will be quite a very good, strong force for good for ECRs from all disciplines, because we're all in it together. So I won't talk any more about that, because that's your job, Stephen, so I'll let you do it. And thank you again for coming to the talk. So, on to you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sam, for the invitation today. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to see this of interest to a community at King's. This is something that we've been pushing at Cambridge and other institutes in the UK. And I think there's a groundswell of opinion now that we should be doing more to support early careers researchers. So I wear several hats today, and so apologies if I slip from one to the other. But, yeah, as well as being a neuroscience researcher and a mathematician, I do a lot of the equality, diversity, and inclusion activities at Cambridge, trying to promote good practice. And to me, what I want to present to you today is really sort of the background and the story behind the Bullied into Bad Science campaign. The first half of the talk is going to be about some of the problems, right? But don't leave after halfway and think, oh, it's all doom and gloom, because actually the second half of the talk is hopefully some positive solutions. So do stay out for the whole talk. There's a URL. The slides are actually what you're looking at now is this link. These are just live off the web. So at various points, if you want particular references, they're just hyperlinks. So don't bother about writing any of the talk down. Just grab the slides, or maybe you can pass them around afterwards if you want them. I'm going to leave some stickers at the front if any of you are into little laptop stickers. Bullied into Bad Science, just to help spread the word. So please, we've got loads, so help yourself. So some declarations of interest. Obviously, I'm a member of and found member of the Bullied into Bad Science campaign. I'm what's called an affiliate editor of the bioRxiv preprint system. Sounds very glorious. All it means is that I get nagged to check papers as they get submitted to bioRxiv and check that they sort of should go on to bioRxiv. And third, I'm actually a senior editor at Scientific Data. This is a paid position, so I feel compromised by taking the money of the publishers. But as I'll explain, I think that that's actually a good thing, because it's a two-way conversation, and change is only going to happen if we're pushing the people like the funders and the publishers. So I believe, I think, I don't feel compromised in telling them what I truly believe about what publishers should be doing. And Scientific Data is a purely open access venue, and I think they're pushing the kinds of things that we want to see. So with those declarations out, really I would like to thank the two people who you should really be hearing from about the Bullied into Bad Science campaign, and that's actually Karina Logan and Lauren Gatto. They set up this early career researcher forum in Cambridge, partly around open con activities that we were doing in Cambridge. And at the time, they were both early career researchers. They have both since left the nest, as it were, leaving Cambridge a couple of years ago, and have gone on to independent positions in Germany and Belgium. And surrounding them, as well as myself, there are people like Ross Mounts, Adrian Curry, helping to push this activity locally in Cambridge. So we've got a website where you can read lots more about the material and background if you want to go into it. There's also actually a sign-up place where you can sign up as an early career researcher or as a PI. Believe that you can no longer call yourself an ECR, to try and show your commitment to this activity. And these kinds of talks, I've done a few of these now. It's very difficult compared to a normal scientific talk where you've just got, introduction, results, conclusions, right? So this is much more sort of just random things that are in my head about where we are as a scientific movement, and it sort of fits in, I think, quite nicely with what I've heard this morning about riots. And so do ask questions, and if if I'm preaching to the converted on stuff and you all just say, oh, we know that, just tell me, right? So I just want to get the most out of this hour, so the more discussion, the better. The slides are there just to sort of seed the discussion. And finally, I'd just like to thank a couple of colleagues for providing some new material that I haven't seen before to go into these slides. So, what does it mean to be bullied into bad science? Right, so, bullied is obviously a very emotional word. If we look at it from a strict human resources angle within any institution, there is very clearly defined meaning. And the Bullied into Bad Science campaign is not necessarily about those everyday or strictly management material or personnel issues about bullying. Right? Those are clearly very important, and they're clearly a problem in many institutions. But that's not really what I want to focus on here. I'm talking more about the kinds of almost implicit, unconscious kinds of activities that happen in science, instituted by senior systems and people, that have an effect primarily on early career researchers. So these are the kinds of activities that are sort of almost taken for granted in labs, but that the impact is on the early career researcher, and it feels like a form of bullying. Okay, so these are the kinds of activities that we sort of want to have discussed and actually want to change, because we don't think that this is a healthy way of doing science. Right? And we acknowledge science is a very competitive arena. Right? It's all about getting the next, getting the next high-profile paper, to get the next high-profile grant, to bring it in and keep your lab sustained. And implicit in that, there's a long hours work culture. I spent 2 years as a postdoc in the US, very productive time, but I hardly ever left the lab. Everybody was working incredibly long hours in the lab. Right? Is that really the best way that we should be doing science and getting the best out of people? Right? Probably not. Publishing is probably the area in which it hits a lot of people first, these kinds of competitions, right? The race to publish first, right, is certainly within the biosciences a key driver to this insanely intense competition. Right? You hear on the rumour mill that your competing lab has got the same reagents and are just about to publish. What do? So you're going to race to publish, and you want to get there first, because you don't get any prizes for publishing second. Right? That's the dogma. It's not necessarily true. If you look at places like PLOS Biology now, they'd immediately try to counter this and say, well, look, you will get scooped, right? Scooping happens. It's a fact of life. It doesn't mean that your study isn't worth publishing in a high-profile place. Right? So already there are solutions. Another place where I've seen it is just labs being super secretive and not wanting to share resources. Even after a paper is published, there's this, well, yeah, that's the paper and that's out, but if you want my data, forget it. I've got another 3 papers I want to publish from this. Right? I'd really love to share it with you, but I can't because I need to get these papers out. Right? All of these kinds of activities are set up to reinforce, I believe, the current structures in science which are contributing to a lot of pressures being exerted onto early career researchers, with the inevitable conclusion that these are felt to be the rules of the game, and then to get ahead in science, I need to play the rules of the game to get my faculty position. Okay? These are the pressures that I think early career researchers are under, and I think it's primarily the job of people who have passed that early career researcher threshold to actually make a change. But in addition to that, there are things that in the second part of the talk, I'll show that there are things that I believe early career researchers can do and should benefit their careers to overcome these kinds of problems. And so I put a point 4 here, ... just really to see if anyone wanted to be brave enough to offer up any other instances where they felt, as early career researchers, there is bullying into bad science implicitly through the culture of science. It's okay if not. Yes?
Not personally, because I'm not a scientist.
That means
that to me is the gentle bullying.
exactly, and I wanted to sort of really focus on these are, you know, you go and talk to your everyday PI and you say, you're bullying your ECRs, and they're like, no,
Yeah,
I'm a good guy, you know, I take them to lab dinners, and it's like, yeah, but you've still got that thing about the Nature paper and you think. So I think the very serious issues that you raise are unfortunately a byproduct of this insane competition, right? The amount of fraud that goes on is, I mean, you can just disappear and just get really sad about science and just never want to do anything because, I mean, fortunately, I think we are learning more about how prevalent these kinds of criminal activities are. You know, manipulating data fraudulently is a criminal offence if you push it to extremes. And you know, there's been in my field of computational biology, you know, people have manipulated data and it's affected cancer trials. Right? I mean, this affects lives. So I think those kinds of fraudulent criminal activities are clearly extreme, and if anybody is on the receiving end of those, then they need, you know, the utmost support immediately from their institutions. Yes, behind.
Also, maybe like a lack of support systems in place to allow people to speak up about it. If they know something dodgy is going on, actually it can be quite a daunting task to bring that up with people that are quite senior, especially if they want to protect the reputation of their institution.
That is an excellent point, right? The whistleblowing is often a career ender, rather than you did the right thing.
Yeah, exactly.
You did the right thing. You know, I've got survivor bias, right? I've got a faculty position, you know, and I'm lucky because I was talking, you know, somebody this morning, you know, said, oh, you need a Nature paper to get a faculty post. And I'm like, well, I got lucky, I didn't, right? But if you see that, you're torn. You're really torn because I agree the structures aren't there yet to say, hang on, there's malpractice in the lab. You only have to look around at high-profile cases and it never ends well so far for the whistleblower. Absolutely. Yes.
I would say maybe one step down the line is the journalism setup that in the peer review culture, the way the system works, that it encourages this because of how you are essentially at the mercy of a reviewer. I hope reviews are here as an the problem, but essentially you can be pressured into taking your paper in a direction more palatable to the reviewer, who is anonymous, which is, you know, on paper a good thing, but in practice you are at the mercy of someone. You don't know who the person is, you can't make the decision, you can't challenge the decision. The editor has the ultimate authority over what you publish.
That's another great example, right? I mean, and, you know, it just seems if you talk to anyone who doesn't, you know, do peer review, it's insane nowadays that we just are beholden to 2 or 3 anonymous people, and then careers can be defined on the basis of that decision. Whereas after it's published, we all know the examples of the high-profile papers that were immediately debunked, right? So there's no guarantee that these 2 people have the same. So that's another great example. Okay, maybe we'll move on. That was very helpful. And please, if there are other things that come up, just interrupt me. So, some of the problems that I wanted to highlight. And this is more or less a laundry list, so I apologize that there's no real sort of theme emerging in here. But I think the number one thing, and it echoes the comment about, you know, the power of editors, right? The notion today is that if you publish in a high-impact journal, that is going to be the game changer. That's going to get you the next research grant or to get you your research fellowship or your faculty position. You know, you need that Nature paper to stand out. And it's all driven by this seemingly innocuous little formula here, right? So as a mathematician, I like formulas, right? This is the definition of the impact factor of a journal, right? So the singular number that somehow is supposed to define the quality of a journal. So to define the impact factor for a journal. You look over the last 2 years, so Y here is indexing the year, so you look over the previous year, year minus 1, and the year before that, year minus 2, and you count the number of citations to paper in that journal over the last 2 years. That's the number at the top. And then you divide by the number of papers that they published. Right? This bibliometric tool, I forget when it was invented, 20, 30 years ago. You know, it was used primarily by librarians just in terms of decisions about which journals to afford to buy. Right? So it was a straightforward tool to help librarians with budgetary decisions. And of course it's been hijacked, right? To the extent now that when you're deciding where to publish, one of the knee-jerk reactions is, well, what's the impact factor of that journal? Right? You know, how could this possibly go wrong? Well, in many ways. You know, it's subject to this problem that, the measure becomes a target, it becomes meaningless. So there's this fantastic paper, some of you may know John Ioannidis, he's published a lot on sort of the flaws of research, certainly in clinical research, in the last 20 to 30 years. They did a little review to look at the various ways in which this has been abused recently. And it's just stunning. And I think the one I just wanted to point out was the thing that I've defined it up here, C and P, as the number of citations and the number of publications. The journal has a degree of freedom as to saying, right, the number of citations, what it wants to do, obviously, is to maximize the top number, the number of citations, and minimize the denominator. And the journal has the ability to say which papers does it want counted as the number of publications, the number P. So if you've got, something, a journal which doesn't just produce articles, but it has letters and editorials and so forth, those can often be excluded. But when those get cited, they can be counted in the top. Right? So journals are just playing this game as just to how to manipulate this number. Right? And it's actually got to the point now where actually, I think last year there were several hundred journals that were actually excluded from having an impact factor because they were seen as gaming the system overly. So you can spot the outliers through this, and the paper goes through the ways. But there's such an insane pressure within the academic system. So, for example, academics in China will get huge financial incentives from certain institutions if they publish in journals with an impact factor over 5. Right? Why 5? Is that the magic factor? But it drives, right? When your salary is dependent on publishing in a certain outlet, of course, as humans, we're going to do the selfish thing and game the system, right? But what we have to do is to look at these things and just say, well, okay, these impact factors are broken. They can't be assessors of quality, right? Or the journal title, right? So, oh, it's a Nature publication, therefore it must be right. It must be important. So things were supposed to get better in the community when we started looking more at open access, right? So a lot of funders, and I think the Wellcome Trust have been really good at pushing open access. Certainly within the UK, it's done a lot, right? There's a sort of a hope that by having more open access materials, the publishing system would get a lot better. The problem is that it hasn't so far, right? So open access publishing has been mainstream now. I think since 2006, the Wellcome Trust have mandated it for their publications. So, it's been around for a long time, and other UK funding councils have done the same. But I think it's summarized in this little joke that went around Twitter. Right, 2 academics walk into a bar, they bring their own drinks, they pay $5,000 and leave feeling both proud and ashamed. It's a publishing metaphor. Right? You just can't explain to anybody on the street the way in which the open access system has been manipulated, I think I would say, to ensure that academics will just go along with this, right? So the funding councils will say, well, you've got to make it open access, okay. So here's a number, and it's typically, I would say, what the market can bear rather than the true costs of publishing. So we're just throwing this money, right? And as academics, you know, if I'm a PI in a grant and the Wellcome Trust will cover these costs, it's no personal loss to me. I can, you know, I can say, oh yeah, to the library, go and pay that number, $5,000. It's, you know, there's a budget for it. Just go and pay it to make it open access. So the publishers are loving this, right? Because there's been no pushback. You know, we've just merrily gone along and said, yeah, okay, this is what we want. Right? It's not really what we want. It's just what we've been told by the publishers. This is really what you want. This is how it's going to solve it. But open access hasn't made things any easier, right? In one sense, it's just provided a lot more publishing outlets, so we feel that eventually we can publish something somewhere, right? But we're getting bullied in another way, right? Because we're just being told to pay these large sums of money, right? And the libraries are already paying for these journals, so there's a lot of what I would call double dipping of these numbers. Okay? And it's important, right? That's somebody's money, right? It may not be yours, but if it were to become yours, you might make a different decision, right? If you had that choice of taking that $5,000 and spending it on an article processing charge, or putting it into your lab budget to hire a summer student, maybe you'd think again. I'm sure you've probably talked many times in this seminar series about the reproducibility crisis. As a core topic, right? So I'm going to try and play devil's advocate for a second, right? I'm not going to do a good job, but I'll try. You know, where's the crisis? What's the crisis? You know, science is doing just fine, right? So here's a study from a bibliometric journal a few years ago now. This is something that Ben Farrar pointed me towards. So what the author did was to study approximately 4,000 papers and analyze them, I think through the assessment of their p-values and their hypothesis testing, whether or not they got a positive result, right? Whether the null hypothesis was rejected. So what we're looking at in these graphs is we've got, along the x-axis, we've got time since 1990 through to 2007. On the y-axis, we've got the percentage of journal articles that declared they have positive results. And what you can see across the three broad categorizations, so the numbers in parentheses are the number of journal articles examined. In physics, biological sciences, and social sciences, we're doing great. We're getting more positive results over time, right? Science is working, right? We're getting positive results. Okay. That's obviously not the point the paper is trying to put at, right? So the title of the journal article is up there, and the blue link actually takes you to the paper. Negative results are disappearing from most disciplines and countries. Right? So there's another figure showing the breakdown by countries. This is a worldwide theme. Right? We are just reporting the things which look great because we've rejected the null hypotheses. Right? All of those studies that don't get to where we don't reject the null hypotheses, where are they going? Right? We're not seeing them. They're getting hidden under the drawer, right? This isn't how science should be. We should be rejecting stuff and publishing stuff, irrespective of whether it's positive or negative. And that's not to say it's the end of the world. So in statistics, there's this classic quote attributed to George Box in the 1970s, which is to say that most models, and in this case, he's referring to statistical models, that most models are wrong, but some are useful, right? Which is to say, you know, we all have these models of how things work, and you know, statistical or theoretical models of how some system works, and they're probably wrong, but it doesn't mean that we can't use them, right? Some of them can still be useful, right? So this is my version. Most papers are wrong, but actually that doesn't make them irrelevant. They're still useful. You will probably find, unless you've written a very, very short paper with just some very sort of trivial proofs in mathematics or something, somewhere or other there'll be something in your paper that's wrong, right? We just have to live with it, right? It doesn't mean to say the paper isn't useful, right? We can still make use of it. And as scientists, we just need to be a little bit more discerning about what we regard as useful, right? Just looking for those null rejections of the null hypotheses is not going to get us very far. So, that's some of the problem. Oh, sorry, one more. And here's something that I think, it's very easy to go bashing and saying the problem is always somebody else's, right? And I think I could spend hours describing how I think the publishers are taking us for a ride and how they're to blame for everything, and they're the bad guys in this. I don't think that's the case. I think publishers, or quite a lot of them, are set up as, they belong to, they're like a society journal, they care about the science and the things that they're reporting. A lot of people in publishing houses previously typically had lives as scientists before they went into the publishing industry and, are now the editors that are looking at our papers. So I think it's very easy to bash publishers and just say they're the bad guys in this. I don't really want to do that. They've got to, if they're for-profit journals, they've got shareholders they're just doing what they can, which is to, to maximize their bottom line. But I do think it's important, so with that caveat, I do think it's important to recognize what is going on now. And that is that publishers are increasingly taking the view that they're not just in the game for publishing papers. There's too many people that can do that and undercut them, right? So what's their business model morphing into? And here's one, this is actually a seminar. Click on the Zurich, it will take you to a seminar that you can whiz over to see at 2 p.m. Zurich time. This is a seminar that's being presented by somebody at Springer Nature, turning data into revenue, monetizing data assets. Right? And I'll just read it if you can't see it. This is the abstract of the seminar. Given the gold rush for data products, let's look at how to productize data assets successfully. We will start with understanding your data assets in detail and their possible benefit and position in the value chain serving users' problems. This will inform your data product strategy from possible customers, delivery business, models, sales, and pricing to IP management. Right? As a scientist, that makes me just very, very uncomfortable. But in layman's terms, what they're talking about is taking the results of scientific, right? The heart of scientific studies is not the papers, the glossy papers and the things. It's the data that you generate, right? If you're doing a large clinical trial and you've got all this lovely, messy data, that's where the gold is, right? In collecting those beautiful data sets, and that's what you want to curate. And the way that you get credit typically for generating those beautiful data sets is through publishing the papers, right? But that's not where the money is. The publishers want those assets, right? They want to monetize them, right? And unless we're very careful, we're just going to be giving away all of our valuable data sets and leaving them to be monetized in some random business speak that I'd be very concerned about. Okay? Springer Nature are not the only, right? All of the big publishers are very interested in this. Universities are already getting sucked into this, right? We're buying these research management systems that sound great because, you can design your study on this system and it will collect your data, and you've got these electronic notebooks, and then it will even help you write the paper, and then it will help you distribute the paper and do all the bean counting for how that paper is assessed. All of these systems are being built by publishing agencies because they want to lock us in as academics, right? Because they realize that's where the money is. The money isn't going to be just in the journals. It's in getting at these data. Okay? So I think that is cause for concern. And the only way around it, I think, is to become a good open scientist. Right? Get the data out there before it's locked into these things. Oh, do I need to talk about the Lancet? Is anybody here particularly fond of the Lancet? So maybe you saw this with the what they call the research parasites, right? So all this data sharing is all very valuable, but I can't just give my data to somebody else and then they take it and they won't be able to understand it, right? This is the thing, you know. These things are going to be, these people are going to be research parasites, right? Well, actually, you know, if I could buy a T-shirt saying I'm a research parasite, I'd go and get one, because I am, you know, and I think that's really what science should be doing. You know, if you spend your time generating a valuable study, why throw the data away once you've stopped looking at it, right? The community can always make use of these data sets, right? And I think if your funding for generating the data collection comes from the public purse, there's a moral imperative to make it publicly available. Anonymity issues aside, of course, especially with human clinical data, it's often difficult to share data. But the MRC are working in ways in which it can be provided protected access. Right? So this is what we should be doing, right? It just reinforces, I think, the Lancet's worldview that we shouldn't be sharing data. So that's all doom and gloom. What about some possible solutions? So what can you as a researcher do, right? Well, I think there's a lot that we can do, and it's about talking and trying to discuss and change our ways, right? So how do you find out where to submit your paper, right? You've got your great study, you know, there may be the knee-jerk reaction, oh, I need to send it to a journal with an impact factor over 5, right? Tell the PI, let's take a deep breath. Is that necessarily the best journal for this, right? Find out where your colleagues are. I like to look, you know, just find out where people are publishing, what people are publishing, not where it is. I may be naive, but in my view, as long as it's on within the biosciences, as long as the paper is on PubMed, it's good enough. I can get a link, I can find it. So when I'm looking for papers, I go to PubMed and just say, I don't care. I've never gone to PubMed and just said, show me the latest 100 articles from this journal. It just seems to be a non-issue. Here I think Twitter has been great for me personally. You know, if I see an interesting paper, I just put a tweet out about it and say, you know, I found this interesting, and normally why, you know, show a key figure or something. And if you've got a community of colleagues that are doing that, you soon learn about stuff, right? You can't, gone are the days where you can keep up with the literature in any traditional sense, right? This is far too much. And in terms of evaluating research, when you see it, you can just say, oh, it's good because it's in, you know, it's in one of these high-impact journals. Sidney Brenner had a series of articles in Current Biology, little, I forget what they're called, endnotes or something. And he came up with this trick, right? And I call it a trick, right? And you're going to be let down. It's not a trick. Right? He simply said, we should remind ourselves that what matters absolutely is the scientific content of a paper, and that nothing will substitute for either knowing it or reading it. Right? No magic number, whether it's being the impact factor of the journal or altmetrics is the new one that people are talking about is a great metric. Right? There is no metric for telling you the quality of the journal article. You have to read it. And unfortunately, that's a pain because it takes a long time. But there is no proxy. Right? Number of citations or anything. Right? If you want to see whether it's good or not, you've got to read it. I think it's really great to hear about, was it Corgi, and about this seminar series. I think it's really important to just get these kind of events going in institutions, to find like-minded souls so that you're not alone, and share good practice and try and get little training events going to do this, because it is hard. You may be the only person in your group who thinks that, you know, maybe we shouldn't just go rushing for the Nature paper. Maybe we should slow down and check that we've done all the right controls. You know, it can be quite isolating to be that difficult voice or the whistleblower that we heard about to say, look, I think something's wrong, you know. You know, it takes courage to say that. But if there's a group of you, you know, that can actually share and support each other, I think that's really important. We found at Cambridge that was working incredibly well with our things around the open comms community. Something I'd like to spend a couple of slides on doing, and again, remember I've got a bioarchive hat to put on. I am an associate editor. Other preprint servers are available. I I just happen to think that bioRxiv has kind of cornered the market. It got there at the right time. So this is a graph of the number of monthly submissions. So the y-axis, we've got the number of preprints posted as a function of time, starting in November 2013 up through November 2019. So this is pretty much the live count as of a couple of days from this interface called Archivist. Okay, so bioRxiv gets approximately right now 3,000 submissions a month, and some of those may be repeat. I think this would include repeated submissions. But now that means it's like 100 a day coming through on bioRxiv. So people aren't, people said this would never work within biology. Right? Biology isn't like physics. I sit in the physics department, and my physicist colleagues, they've been using archives since the early 1990s, and for them it's the primary source of information, and it's great. Every morning they just get a little update from archive. These are the new archive preprints that have been published. And everybody felt biologists would be just too much, this is too new for us. I can only post something after it's been published, and so it's too late. I'm not going to bother with preprints. Lots of arguments for why not. Okay. But I think this graph is showing there's still a long way to go, right? This is only, compared to however many papers are published per month. This still has a long way to go, okay? But it gives you, I think, so many advantages in this chaotic, competitive world that we are currently in. So here are the top 6 are actually I've just summarized the views from PLOS, and so PLOS is one of the journals which is very preprint friendly. So why bother with the preprint? First of all, it's incredibly quick, right? bioRxiv, there's a bit of a bottleneck. You have to rely on people like me to check the paper, so it can be a couple of days between submission and it going live. Other preprints like the OSF, I think, is pretty much immediate. Right? So you can be, it can be there within minutes. You get a DOI pretty much immediately. So you can start sharing your results, whereas in the old view, you have to wait for the paper to go through peer review and then proofing and stuff. It could be a couple of years before your paper appears. Right? When you're on the job market, I couldn't believe that people used to write on their CVs, here's a bunch of authors, here's a fancy title, and they put in preparation, right? Everybody knows that just means it's an idea you had this morning, right? It's not a paper, right? But people put it. But now, when you're applying for funding, you can list preprints. They're there immediately, right? Because UK funding agencies allow you to put preprints on your CV and cite them in your grant application. So they don't have to, reviewers of your grants don't have to just trust you. They can go and look for themselves. Right? So for that alone, I think it's really nice. Number 2, people are always worried about scooping in biology. Well, I need to be the first to publish and I need to rush this out, so I'm not going to do the 3 months of controls. Okay, well, if it really is so important that you want to be shown to be the first person to publish on this particular topic, stick a preprint archive up and it's there. Right? It may not stop you from being scooped, but whenever people have asked, did a preprint ever stop? Did you ever publish a preprint and then get scooped, or did you share your data and then get scooped? I've only seen one example of somebody who said, well, I've shared my data, in this case it was sharing data, I shared my data and then I got scooped, or somebody else did the study. And so when I followed up with this person, it turns out that they published the data, I think there was some imaging data set, they published it 6 or 7 years ago. They had then got round to finding a student to work on it, but of course it was an interesting question to ask, so somebody had actually done that study, right? And he just said, I don't want to make a big deal of it, right? That's why I shared the data. It's just unfortunate that it got done. You can increase attention to your work, right? You don't have to be beholden to these magical 2 reviewers to give you the So you can get this attention. And if you want to go counting your citations, you can, right? So you can check on bioRxiv how many people have accessed it, or you can see where the citations are, because you get a regular digital object identifier, a DOI. So generally, it more, it can help with career advancement. You're showing that you're pushing stuff out there. You've not got the gatekeepers of the publishers to sort of in control of what papers you can push out. Number 5 is a subtler one, right? This notion of community. But I think there is a feeling that if you're doing this, you're sort of doing the right thing. You're sharing your results early, and you're trying to be a good scientist. And people respect that by and large, and actually develop this notion of a good, solid community. And of course, if you publish a preprint before the paper is finished, people can then comment on it, right? So the paper can be revised. Whereas when you publish your paper, it's too late, right? People can comment on it, but you can't change your paper, right? Whereas if you stick up a preprint during the submission phase, you've got chance to take those into account. Okay. Lots of other, I think, advantages. Something that's starting to happen, I've noticed, but speaking to editors of scientific data, it's not really been that successful yet, is that editors are even now starting to look through the preprint servers, fishing effectively to see whether that's a paper that they would like to encourage to go to their journal. Right? And I've had this a few times with my preprints. People have said, oh, have you got a journal in mind yet? If you haven't, look at mine. And this is actually quite revolutionary, right? It's sort of the other way around. You've got the product, you've got your paper, and people come to you and say, yes, I want that. And I think the last thing about preprints, the little nugget that Naomi Penfold, I think, again, if you click on her name, you'll get the blog post she wrote, is that the RAF, which is often the recipient of a lot of criticisms for how it's shaping research evaluation in the UK, I would like to say, to its credit, it has explicitly allowed preprints to be submitted as a valid research article. Right? It doesn't have to be peer-reviewed to be accountable for a ref. And the ref reviewers are supposed to look and evaluate that just as they would any other journal article. Now, this is the first time I think it's explicitly been mentioned. Ref 2014, maths were kind of informally doing this, but not really formally. I think most UK universities will take a very conservative line and just say, okay, you've got a preprint, but if you've got 4 or 5 other papers that have been peer-reviewed, stick those in instead. But I think at least RAF have done the right thing in this case of allowing us to submit them. So when should you submit a preprint? So this is not real data. This is a sort of an estimation of relative pros and cons. This is based off a piece that my colleague Nico Kriegerstorter, who was at the CBE Cognition and Brain Unit a few years ago, did. So there's a risk of publishing a preprint too early. So that's the red line. Right? So time is along the x-axis. So this is the time of submission. So if you submit a preprint too early, you have the risk of being scooped. Right? So this is a strong negative. Right? This is on the y-axis is the relative benefit. So a strong negative benefit. You could get scooped if you publish too early. Okay? But on the other hand, if you get a preprint out really early, the dark blue line here, you get the precedence benefit. You're the first to have published something. And equally, the earlier you publish, the more likely you are to generate citations. Okay? So none of these are highly subjective figures. I wouldn't take them as gospel. The general point I would take, however, is that the black line is just when you sum up the individual colours to give you the sum total. Right? So there may be a slight negative effect of publishing too early relative to the time of submission, but there's a broad period where you're above the benefit equals 0 line. So overall, you should be publishing in preprints. And most people, I think Nico's view in his group, certainly my group, is that I tend normally to submit a preprint at the time of submission, so that it's out there, and you don't have to worry about waiting 3 months for the reviews. It's available if people want to start reading it. And there's been a study which showed that when you correlate, if you try and correlate the preprint version with the final article, there's a very high correlation between the two, right? Which tells us that papers do get changed through the peer review process, but that change isn't really that high. I'd also like to point out this, I think this really great article by Florian Markovic, this piece talking about whether we should be moral or selfish when we're trying to be an open scientist. So before, the selfish view is that if I publish, if I put up a preprint selfishly, the best time for me is post-submission, because effectively is already under review, but I still get the benefits of the preprint. So that's a selfish decision, and that's in a good way, right? So the moral reasons, I think, for being an open scientist are all very laudable, and we like to share things and be good scientists. That doesn't cut it, right? In the cut and thrust of a scientific lab. We need to talk about the good selfish reasons for why we should start sharing. And Florian's article outlines some of the reasons. I just wanted to put a slight spin on it, taking this 5. So, first of all, funding mandates now actually want you to be sharing data. So if you don't share your data, you're not going to get the grant because of your data sharing statement isn't there. You can start to get credit for sharing your data now. So you write a data paper, you can get regular credit through your CV. By sharing your data, you find bugs and problems, right? I had a data set I published, and about 2 years later, somebody pointed out that 2 of the files that I thought were distinct files from distinct mice were actually the same recording, right? And that had passed me by, so I managed to fix that and change the analysis. 4, I think, is a great one. So there was a study from Vines et al. 2014. If you don't make active steps to share your data, you may think, oh, well, it's on that laptop, it's fine. I'll be able to remember it. Data disappears, right? And they estimated it was about 7% a year, right? And the number one reason I put it down to is that, students who are responsible primarily for a large bulk of data collection have a habit of leaving, right? They graduate, right? It's a very annoying habit that they disappear, right? And for a very good reason. And as they disappear, all of the knowledge about which files were of use or where they were recorded goes with them. I think number 5 is important. The best reason for being an open scientist is not to improve your other people's lives, it's to improve your life. Right? I've worked on so many studies now, and I can't remember where I've put the data necessarily on it. But it doesn't matter, because I can just Google it, right? Because it's all open and it's in these repositories, right? So my mechanisms for finding my own data are made much easier, because I know that I've shared it. Number 6, now is a really good time to be an open scientist. If you start doing open activities and publishing your data, you can get pretty good credit for it, right? It's still seen as the unusual thing to do. If everything goes well, in 10 years' time, that won't be the case, and it will just be an expectation. You need to do this, whereas now you're standing out from the crowd. Number 7, I'm just surprised, right? I publish my data and my code. People just randomly contact me out of the blue that I've never had any previous contact with. Normally it's to say, well, thanks for sharing your code. It doesn't work for me, so can you fix it, right? And inevitably that I do, and that may lead to a further collaboration, right? So again, it's in my interest to share things. I get more out of it. And number 8, I actually had an example. I made a data set openly available. One of the reviewers didn't quite like the way that I presented the data. And so he said, oh, but no matter, I've got the data, I've got the code that Stephen used, so I've downloaded it, and here's how I present it. And so they showed in their review They gave me the new figure and said, this is how I plot it. I was like, yeah, great, thank you. Right? They're doing your work. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. But overall, I think there is a strong imperative, I think, especially in experimental sciences. The primary rule is that data should be shared. Right? Anonymity reasons aside, the cost of generating the data means that you shouldn't just bury it after publishing your paper. Right? And I think this is the view of most of the funders, and if they're providing the funding for the project, they will have the say on this with their data management plans. I put in a blank slide here for pre-registration studies. Has this already been covered? Yeah. So I didn't really want to say too much on pre-registration studies, except to make the point that, and this comes from, I think it was Dorothy Bishop at Oxford who said this, and I think it's worth reiterating, is that if you write a traditional paper and you say, well, here's my experiment, and this is what I did, and this is how I found it, as a peer reviewer, you can be really mean and picky and say, yeah, but you shouldn't have done it like that. You should have done the experiment like this, and you should have analyzed the data like that. Reject. Right? So that's the reviewer being really mean. With pre-registration, I think the point of the reviewer becomes much more positive and supportive, because rather than leaving those to after the experiments have been done, the reviewer can say, well, that's a good idea for an experiment, but have you thought about doing it this way because of the following reasons? And so there's a chance for the review to actually affect the study being undertaken. And I think for that alone, pre-registration of large experimental studies is something to be supported. I'm not going to go into this about the journal subscription model, unless it comes up in questions. Finally, I would say that I hope what I've shown in the solutions is mostly about what individuals can do. But I think there is a push that we can do to our institutions to try and get them to help with this. DORA, the Declaration of Research Assessment, I think is something that most UK universities will effectively be signing, if nothing else, because the Wellcome Trust have said it will be a condition of funding. Right? I would just, however, make the point that signing is very easy. The commitment from the institution to actually implement those processes is incredibly hard. I think it's very important for institutions to give early career researchers a voice within those institutions in various panels and wherever these kinds of activities and evaluations are being undertaken. Institutions need to recognize that all research artifacts are important, not just the shiny glossy papers that give the nice view of the work. Right? That's not really where the scholarship is. It's all the messy stuff, the raw data, the code, the thinking, all the stuff that went wrong. That's where the real scholarship is, and it needs to be recognized. I mentioned this point before about ownership of funds. You know, the question becomes whether I'm going to pay $5,000 for an APC. It becomes very different if I can use that money for alternative things within my hard-pressed lab. And routes to open access need to be made much easier for everyone, not just for researchers, but for the administrators running these systems. Green open access, the variant of open access, which just says, share your manuscript that's been accepted, whatever the format is, I think achieves that. And something that I would encourage academics and institutions to support is this notion of diamond open access, where it's not just free to read, but it's free for the author to publish in. So it needs to be maintained by a journal grant or something. And at Cambridge,